Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinars. My name is Kirk Higgins and I'm the Senior Manager of Content at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And my name is Rachel Davison-Humphreys and I'm the Director of Outreach here at the Institute.
And we are fortunate enough to be joined this week by Chris Evans, a member of our Teacher Council from Arizona. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So this week we're taking a little bit of a different approach. So the last few webinars we've been working through, we've had on a content expert and we've looked at things from sort of a broader perspective. And this week we're hoping to experiment a little bit and dive a little bit deeper into a specific topic and do a close reading. And Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about what our approach is going to be, what our pedagogical approach is going to be today?
Absolutely. So close readings, as you know, are this really powerful form of pedagogy. They take a little bit of time for your students to get used to the kind of analytical thinking skills that are necessary to really understand a document in its context and history. But the reward is that much richer because it's helping students see the documents themselves, learn the language, investigate their own philosophical questions as they approach those texts. So what we wanted to do with these close reading webinars is give you, our teacher community, an opportunity to do a close reading with us. So we started this one with the Monroe Doctrine and are pairing it. So often when you have a primary source document, pairing the documents or getting a group of documents together can really flesh out some of the themes. Other times focusing on just one, like Declaration of Independence, right? That is one massive document, doesn't really need any attendant documents. That's like, oh, I don't know, a graduate seminar length document, but you can also just focus on that one document in class. For us, we also paired it with a set of documents from our Gilded Age and Progressive Era curriculum called The Debate on the Annexation of the Philippines. So you can find both of these documents in the link in the chat box. And that'll take you directly to our 10th period webinar page on our website where you can find our copy of the Monroe Doctrine, which will eventually appear in our new resource called Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness, which is a comprehensive, self-paced, fantastic adaptive learning platform resource that will launch this year. And then you can also find the link to this resource on resources.mybri.org. but also on the website that's going to be in the chat box. So let's start by saying, Kirk, why did we choose these documents?
Sure. So with President's Day coming up, we're thinking a lot about presidents and their relation to the Constitution. So what is the constitutional role of the executive, and how does that play out in a variety of different facets? And one interesting way that the president is within our government is as the chief diplomat, the diplomat-in-chief, if you will. Not an official title, obviously, but by that I mean he or she sets foreign policy and can help direct the nation's attitude towards other leaders. They meet with other world leaders. They are a part of conversations at the highest level. And so we chose these two documents, one because the Monroe Doctrine is a seminal text in American history. So it is the foundation stone, 1823, President James Monroe, in conjunction with his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, issues this doctrine during Monroe's State of the Union address, something I think we should talk about a little bit later on, and basically asserts American sovereignty over the Western Hemisphere, or not sovereignty, but that is to say that the Western Hemisphere is America's, or the United States' sphere of influence. This is not something that is accepted as being okay. It wasn't accepted then. It's something that's contested and debated, but that was the intention. So fast forward from there, after the Monroe Doctrine, looking at how that document compares with what happens in the Spanish-American War. So we're moving up into the 1890s, 1898 to be exact, in looking at what intervention in a war with Spain, so both happen to come roundabout regarding the same country, Spain, but also what American attitudes are, what's being debated, and how America is looking, if they're looking internally with the Monroe Doctrine, internally and towards the Western Hemisphere, what does it mean in the Spanish-American War when they begin to look outward? What do questions of imperialism mean for the United States? How is it that that question gets debated and discussed. So, and what is fundamentally, what is the executive's role in those conversations? So looking at it from those two perspectives, we have James Monroe on the one hand and William McKinley on the other hand, and a pretty rich conversation in between.
Absolutely. And so Chris, you're our expert in the classroom. How long have you been teaching, Chris?
This is my 12th year.
12th year. And so you teach, what courses are you currently teaching? Or
Right now, I'm currently teaching AP US History to juniors. I teach AP Macroeconomics and Economics to seniors as well.
And in the past, you've also taught other histories?
Yeah, I've taught pretty much the entire gamut. I've taught world history. I've taught AP comparative government and politics. I've taught 8th grade civics to our accelerated middle school students. I've been kind of all over the map, yeah.
That's awesome. As many of us in small schools are, you become the social studies or the history department. Okay, so Chris, for you, what happened reading these documents? So I know you just taught this in your classroom. What were these documents like for you in this read through? What came out to you?
So starting with the Monroe Doctrine, which we would have covered in first semester, I think the thing that's important to talk to students about is how much of a fundamental shift this really is in American foreign policy at the, really the youth of our nation. We talk so much about Washington's farewell address, how he stresses, neutrality, and that carries over with Adams. And then you get into the presidency of Jefferson and Madison, and they obviously have their own foreign policy complications to a certain extent, but really this becomes the kind of foundational American foreign policy for the 19th century. And so digging into this early on is a really good way of understanding, just how America wanted to present itself to Europe during that period of time.
And I think that's a really good context to just kind of dive into the text. So on our version, we have some line numbers, and we're putting those up on the screen for everybody watching so you can follow along. But let's just go to the first line, the Monroe Doctrine from President Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress. So Kirk, you were mentioning that it's important that this was part of the annual address to Congress, of his State of the Union address. Why did you want to bring that up?
So a couple of things. One, I think it's really important just for the context. So it's not that Monroe is issuing this statement as a piece of legislation for Congress to approve. He, as the president, is speaking in his capacity as the executive and saying this now will set our foreign policy initiatives moving forward. So basically he's outlining the interests of the nation. So I think it's interesting from that perspective. I also think it's always interesting just to remember that this wouldn't have been delivered in person. It would have been given to Congress, and Congress would have read it out to itself on behalf of the executive, right? So I think that it does two things. One, I think this entire document shows how things are consistent, like Chris was talking about, with how the Washington administration sort of began thinking about American foreign policy, but then also how things begin to vary. McKinley also wouldn't have delivered a State of the Union to the legislative branch itself, but soon thereafter, Woodrow Wilson, I believe, was the first to actually give that address in person. And that's an interesting context, again, just for the changing role of the executive, the changing relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. This first paragraph it seemed to me, is a diplomatic tool. That's how I read this first paragraph. He's speaking to the honor and tradition of the other governments, and honoring that they have their way of doing things and we have our way of doing things. Is that how you both read this paragraph?
Go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah, I did. And what stands out to me as being interesting is that he's really fixated on their political systems, right? So it's not just them, it's not just their governments, but it's also their political system. It seems like he is actually concerned with monarchical government, for lack of a better word, having an impact here in the Western Hemisphere.
Yep. I definitely picked up on that as well. And, talking about matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, I think that really is highlighting how we are a republic that is meant to be governed by the people who are an informed citizenry, and it's a kind of a shot at the monarchies in Europe at the time, who really aren't necessarily concerning themselves with the will of the people, which is where all of these revolutions are stemming from over in our sphere of influence, as Kirk was saying.
Yeah, I really honed in on that sentence as well, because it is so pointed, right? That he is making there's a contrast there, and the question to ask students is what is he contrasting, right? Why is he focusing on that matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens? How is that different from what the ideals of American democratic republic, that like the values of the democratic republic are?
Right.
So I think, was there anything else in this paragraph that struck you?
Well, I just think holding on to it for, as we move to the other documents too, because it does, he's very much bragging about our system of government, right? He's saying, we have enjoyed, unexampled, felicity this whole nation is devoted. So the idea is, hey, look, we got a pretty good system. We don't need yours coming over here. And I think that begins to lay the seeds for the kind of pride that America exhibited that then sort of continued to grow, and I think is expressed in a different way later in the 1890s.
Right, and that leads right to that next sentence. So line 6 on that second paragraph. We owe it therefore, because our whole nation is devoted to this, we owe it therefore to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. We have this unexampled felicity, right? And our whole nation is devoted. I found that idea of the hemisphere interesting. And I didn't know if either of you had any thoughts on, like, Canada and Mexico are a thing, but he's making a claim to the whole hemisphere.
Well, I think at the same time, right, Canada still to a certain extent is the Queen's Dominion during this time, and so we're maybe a little bit hesitant to think that they are of an independent mind, maybe the way that we are. And so I think that his claim about, this being a declaration is also a throwback to maybe the other time that we have made a declaration to the European countries that we are an independent people, and that the independence of our hemisphere, our sphere of influence, should be considered kind of the same way. And so the audience being Congress here, I think, as you were talking about the way in which he emphasizes how great our form of government is, maybe this is a callback to, the time of the revolution and the framers and how they enshrined our government. Yeah.
Yeah. I would be curious how often the word declare has, tracking the word declare in presidential speeches would be interesting. I think that would be an interesting project for some grad student.
There you go. Some aspiring thesis out there.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that project, but some grad student out there should do that project.
Well, I think the hemisphere piece is interesting too, because you can look at it two ways, right? One, it can be the idea that, look, America's already projecting itself well beyond its borders and saying, look, not only is us coast to coast, is that where we want to occupy, even though we don't yet. But it's that sort of continental vision that we have. But even looking beyond that, to say the entire hemisphere, seems pretty bold. Or arrogant, if you want to go that far. at the same time, I think that the historical context is important too. So at this time, America had just settled a treaty with Spain, settling our western borders. There's still disputes going on over what would become Mexico. And then you also have the Russians interfering in Alaska with the fur trade, right? So Russia's brokering a separate treaty both with Britain and with us. And so there's this sense of instability. I mean, I thought, Chris, your comment was really good. It's us coming out of sort of, it's America maturing a bit, right? And so I think it's us asserting ourselves a little bit into that conversation. And because, the interests were impacting us throughout the entire hemisphere, here he's really saying, like, not only is it direct intrusions on our country, but Monroe basically saying, look, we understand that any impacts over here from European nations are going to impact us too. And I think he gets into that a little bit further down the document.
Absolutely.
I also think that you can tie this back into some of the issues that America had during the War of 1812, the lingering of European, embattlements in the Louisiana Territory. That bleeds over into conversations about the Adams-Onis Treaty with Florida. And so we really do have a complicated relationship with Europe and with regards to where territorial claims end and begin. And so I think this really is a bold declaration about the U.S. taking a stance for what it believes is its claims.
Absolutely. And the war, I mean, looking at the dates, the War of 1812 was very much generationally still present in the diplomacy of the period. So the diplomats that were in office during the War of 1812 would have been similar to those that were in Monroe's cabinet or Monroe's appointments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's just keep moving on, because that goes right into that next paragraph. We declared our neutrality, right? So in the war with those new governments, this is line 15. In the war with those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition. And to this we have adhered and shall continue to adhere, provided, here's a little caveat, no change shall incur in which in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government shall make a corresponding change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. So this is we're going to hold to what we said we were, unless someone else changes what they're doing, and then we'll change what we're doing. This is where the teeth come out, right?
Yeah, I think that if I'm looking at this with my students, I'm going to ask them, who are those new governments that they're asking about, and ask them, my students, if this is the U.S. staking a claim to neutrality between revolutionaries that do not have their own independence already, and in Spain, and whether that is a callback to our revolutionary past, and basically giving legitimacy to revolutions that are in progress, where Spain in this case and other places might not necessarily appreciate that.
Solidarity of sorts.
Exactly.
What did you take about this, Kirk?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Chris was talking about too. I also think it's a cool opportunity to be able to step back and look at the broader world picture of what's taking place. I think so often in U.S. history, we're very tempted to become very focused on what's happening in the United States, but there are things that are happening in less so in Canada, that was a little more stable, but certainly in nations to the south of us that were helping, that were impacting the thought process of our leaders. And I think those movements for independence in South America in particular were a huge part of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, those new governments. And I think that one of the things that students don't put in context often is the radicalness of the American independence and what effect that had on their monarchical structures, right? Mm-hmm. That this idea of self-governance was new in modernity and had spillover effects inspirationally into other revolutionary groups. And I think that's what you were getting at, Chris, with those new governments,
yeah.
And how they would come to the U.S. and learn from our living revolutionaries, read the texts of Jefferson, and they would read Locke, and they would do all the things that our founders did in order to support the philosophy of their own revolutions. So yeah, and that goes right into the next part. I love how I think this what struck me about reading the Monroe Doctrine, and I was not as familiar with it because I did not spend a lot of time in U.S. history in my teaching career. I spent more time in world and ancient history, but so I'd only read this in a kind of surface way. But what struck me also by the time I got to the third paragraph was I was wondering about audience here, and I think we've touched that a little bit because Kirk, you mentioned that this is being read aloud to Congress, but it's also a bit of a, I want to say stump speech, but it's it's a bit of a rallying to the general population. I feel. Did that strike you all as well?
I think that goes back to context as well, because when we're talking 1823, and you think about this being his 7th State of the Union address. So if we are to assume that he is going to follow tradition and he's only going to serve 2 terms, then he's not necessarily worried about getting reelected again, which maybe makes him a little bit more bold in what he feels he can declare to, our Congress and to, a candid world, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's also galvanizing, right? So he's looking at his electorate, and this is towards the end of the quote unquote era of good feelings. Whether or not those good feelings really existed or not is up for debate. But this is sort of an assertion of a national view that, again, I think is the kind of assertion that presidents make, right? Being elected to this office, he's asserting and speaking on behalf of the country, or the country that's represented in the government, and I think that definitely comes through in this, right? I mean, it's an assumed, this is speaking on behalf of the United States, but also again asserting sort of that sovereignty on the national stage in a way that was different for the United States. I think some historians note that this is when, the United States stopped looking eastward towards Europe and really started looking westward back toward the United States, which I think is pretty clear from these statements. He's reassuring everyone, look, we're not looking to expand and interfere in your in what you're doing, but any move you make here does impact us, and we see that as something that we need to act upon. Particularly that idea of systems, which he talked about earlier. But that those systems, it's not just their troops actually being here, but it's also their system of government is in some way impacting the United States, which I think is really interesting.
Right. That's a conversation for another time when we talk about how the different cultures of America mix and blend in the very unique way that they do, coming from all these different political cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this next paragraph, I think I don't know if we have favorite paragraphs, because I don't know, but the 4th paragraph, I love this checklist, this checklist of foreign policy. What is the foreign policy of America according to Monroe in 1823? Well, not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of Europe's powers, to consider the government de facto as a legitimate government, to cultivate friendly relationships with it, and preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of power, submitting to injuries from none. There you go. Sounds pretty good.
There you go. Wrap it up.
I know. I was like, okay, I'm sold, right? Like, is that real? Or is that aspirational? Or is that just a declaration?
paragraph.
What's that, Chris?
a setup for the next paragraph.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, why don't we look at that paragraph then? So we can do both these paragraphs. Why don't you take us to where you see that final paragraph tying this all together?
Well, I think that what you were saying, he's establishing, friendly relations with all these governments, and then in the next paragraph, he transitions with a nice large but in regard to those continents' circumstances, and then he moves it along to when in which we might have issues with those European nations if they were to say affect our southern brethren, right? I think looking to Latin America, South America, and then basically says that we're not going to have any form with indifference. And I think that that's him saying we're not going to stand by while you interfere over here. If you want to have your turmoil over in Europe, we will stay out of that. But if you are going to try and cause a disturbance in our sphere of influence, then we are going to take concern.
Yeah, which, I mean, and I think, it is sort of a rhetorical flourish, but I think it's one of the reasons that this document had such purchase, right? Is that setup followed by what Chris just pointed out, which is, look, stay over in Europe, and you're fine. If you don't mess with us or interfere with what we have going on over here, then we'll stay out of your hair too. And I think he kind of calls him out in line 30 when he's talking about, look, you're too far away to do anything anyway. It's not effective to try to govern us or govern this area. So why bother? Which was their argument for how they got the Adamonis Treaty signed in the first place. It was, look, you're not able to control what's going on your frontier. Thanks in part to Andrew Jackson illegally invading Spanish territory and stirring up all kinds of problems and doing all kinds of not so great things, but basically calling out Spain for not really having a hold of their territories. And I think here he's asserting, look, we're closer. This is directly in our interest, and we are now strong enough as a nation to assert ourselves in a way that we have not before. And I think that is the executive executing, what he's seeing as a ratified treaty with the Adamonis Treaty, being sort of that mandate from Congress, and him moving forward with really asserting what the real impacts of that are.
Is this the first? I think you mentioned earlier that that historians say this is when we looked away from Europe and looked kind of, I guess the way would be described would be like up and down at ourselves, because this extends into the entire hemisphere. And I don't know, my geography is, I'm gonna question my own geography, but I'm pretty sure that Europe, it's not, I mean, we're as far from parts of the southern hemisphere as Europe is. Maybe. I mean, triangles, I don't know trigonometry. But is this a spurious claim? Is it a rhetorical claim?
I definitely think rhetorical. I mean,
okay.
I definitely think he, are we really going to be able to go down and help, Bernardo O'Higgins in Argentina any better than, or Chile, sorry, my South American history is not great, but are we able to go down and help out those South American independence movements? No, I don't think so. But I think, again, this is thinking, I mean, if you're going to, why stop at the Northern Hemisphere when you can say just the whole Western Hemisphere and draw the line and be done with it? But I think it's also kind of implicit that it's the close. I mean, I think he's thinking more about the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and Mexico directly, and not, I mean, also thinking about South America, but I don't know that, I don't know how far American power would have extended. Although I think that at least one battle with the British took place during the War of 1812 off the coast of South America between the U.S.'s Constitution and the Java, maybe? I'm not sure. Someone can call me out on that. But so, I mean, we were around there. We had commerce interests, but I don't know how well we were really able, how possible it was for us to project forward.
I mean, moving forward into the 20th century, we certainly had a lot of influence in Central and South American. We placed ourselves into a lot of situations in Central and South America later on down the road for a variety of reasons, having to do with Cold War and other interests.
Even before that, I mean,
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt in particular begins, drumming up that, and that's essentially what the Spanish-American War is too, is us projecting out. I think the Monroe Doctrine is less seen as us trying to project power, and that's really what Monroe, I think, is saying here. It's not so much that we're going to intervene in other parts of the hemisphere. We're just saying if you're doing things that we see as a direct threat to us, which includes trying to recolonize or reassert, interest in South America, then we may have interest to intervene.
Right. So yeah. All in all, it's a really strong statement, right? I mean, if this is a declaration of a policy, it has a lot of clarity. It tugs at your retort, like the rhetoric tugs at your nationalist heartstrings. What are the effects? What does this do? Why is this such a pivotal moment in our foreign policy?
Well, I think one of the things that Kirk said struck me in talking about projection. Is this you can ask your students, is this a projection about what he wants the Congress to feel with regards to America's strength in the Western Hemisphere, or is this what he wants Europe to feel about America's strength in the Western Hemisphere? Because there were certainly members of Congress who were not necessarily interested in America looking beyond our borders and trying to maybe interfere in the affairs of European nations and say focused on what's happening domestically. And I certainly think when Kirk brought up the era of good feelings, right? You look at the northern states and in the what used to be the foothold of the Federalist, kind of territory, who really has ceded any and all political authority to kind of the Jeffersonian, Madison, Monroe kind of branch of political ideology. They might need a little bit of convincing that America's interests may lie beyond where our borders currently rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think too, that's where I think having that other set of documents is actually really interesting, because you can really see the difference between what Monroe is outlining in the Monroe Doctrine and then the debate over imperialism in the next set of readings. Because Monroe, I agree. Is clearly, I think it's an interesting question to pose to students, right? I think even the rhetoric of McKinley is so radically different than it is of Monroe.
Let's turn to that McKinley. So that's on page 2 of handout D. We have the document here. It's nice and orange. And so, so this is an excerpt from President McKinley in 1899. So we're 70 years in the future. But what were you seeing in here, Kirk, that really, that you saw as conversation with the Monroe Doctrine?
Well, I thought, I forget where. So in paragraphs sort of between 5 and 10 and 15 on the Monroe Doctrine compared to the McKinley piece, Monroe is essentially saying, look, these South American countries are desirous of independence, and we should not, you should not interfere with them if that's the direction that they want to go. And here McKinley's coming in very much looking now, and obviously this is later on in the century. There's a lot of really negative perceptions around race that's very central to a lot of these conversations, and that can't be forgotten. And I think what is coming out here is this idea that, look, they're not they're not suited for self-government. It's almost a paternalistic thing that we're doing. It's a charitable look. This fell into our laps. They need us to help them to become this way. And that seems very much in contrast to what Monroe is saying. Monroe is almost saying, and I don't want to go too far with this, because I don't think that Monroe would have been this, truly radically open, anybody can self-govern kind of a president, but his rhetoric is certainly a lot more of allowing for self-determination, as opposed to McKinley here, who's saying, look, Philippines fell into our lap, and now we have a responsibility to care for this group of people in a way that they're not able to prepare for themselves. And that contrast, I think, is very stark.
And that's actually in line 3 here. Like, he talks about that this fell into our lap. We couldn't give them back to Spain because that would be cowardly and dishonorable, I guess, for the U.S. So the first 2 points are about foreign relations, but that third point gets to that kind of grossly paternalistic, they are not fit to govern themselves, and they would have anarchy and misrule that was worse than what Spain was. And then he goes on to explain what he means by they don't have self-government. They aren't educated, they don't have civility, or they don't have Christianity. And so again, this is placed very much in the context of the time, but not that different from a lot of foreign policy throughout American history.
And I think that I would also, with my students, want to ask them how they would compare this to the way that America has dealt with our Native American population throughout the 19th century as well, in particular, because there are a lot of parallels that you can see between trying to declare them unfit to govern themselves, and essentially trying to educate and uplift and civilize and Christianize the way that McKinley is speaking here.
And also explicitly and implicitly in a lot of policies in the Middle East, right? So sometimes more explicit, sometimes more implicit in a lot of those discussions as well, that they are unfit to rule themselves, therefore we must intervene.
Yeah, and I think that the richness in that discussion too comes from the fact that this is being hotly contested, right? And that's why I think Mark Twain's comments, just the one section before this, Twain had been an imperialist up to this point, and it's almost this sort of paternalistic thing that changes him. He had been an imperialist, and then he sees, look, what was his line, in a very Twain line?
It seems to me, be our pleasure and our duty to make these people free.
Yeah.
And let them deal with their own domestic questions in their own way. And so I am an anti-imperialist. Yeah, and I think our ellipsis leaves out, he uses this illusion of an eagle, and it's like that the eagle grips its talons into this thing and saying, look, we're not abiding by this spirit of liberty that we say we're abiding by. And so then we're projecting rule, and so he's therefore against now. So, and Twain was one of the early people that is really pushing for us to expand, us to intervene in the Spanish American War, and now here for him to publicly change his mind like this is really significant. And again, I think shows. I think so often we get this idea in history that everything is inevitable. And I think that denies a lot of the richness of this debate. And I think it's interesting to see here people pushing back precisely because what is America's role in the world, which all of these documents are really asking, is in question and being discussed and debated. Right, and I think that's actually there's an interesting parallel with Twain's comment with Schertz's, Secretary of the Interior Carl Schertz's comment on the very first page of the document. Because there he says, and this portends the future, right? If we turn this war, which was heralded to the world as a war of humanity, in any sense into a war of conquest, we shall forever forfeit the confidence of mankind, and we shall be met with general distrust in our international relations under circumstances which will make that distrust especially troublesome and dangerous. And I think that portends kind of a lot of difficulties that we have in foreign relations in the future. That when you go in with an express declaration, because that word has come up quite a few times, of how you are going to interact with a nation or with the peoples of a nation, and then you change your policy, or the policy evolves, that distrust is especially troublesome and dangerous.
Yeah, I think that you bring up an interesting point about what the reputation of America is internationally during this period of time, and how there is kind of an evolving concern about that reputation as America's military power is increasing as we go from the 19th to the 20th century. We certainly are becoming more and more powerful and much more of a presence. And so how are we going to use that new power? Are we going to use it to promote our ideals about self-government around the world, or at least our sphere of influence? Or are we going to use it to extend our goals onto other people and other places around the world?
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think too, just to tie that into something else that we touched on in the Monroe Doctrine, on William Jennings Bryan's comments about particularly most of the way down, that question that Chris just posed, I think it gets directly on this, because it's not only how it is we're going to conduct that, but he also says they must also calculate its effects upon our nation. So in other words, if we're going to project this and we're going to be an imperial nation, what does that mean not only for those people who we may govern, but what does it mean for us? How does it change? How does it we perceive ourselves? How does it perceive how it is that we're aligning our own governing structures, which isn't radically dissimilar, I think, to what Monroe was hinting at about having those foreign political systems on our shores, right? It's us having that close to us is somehow impacting us. And so too here, us projecting power out and fundamentally changing or moving away from that sort of idea of neutrality. What does that portend? And I think here he's alluding to, what does it mean to have a standing army? I mean, then that question goes all the way back to even the English Civil War. And what does it mean for us to having the capacity to protect power in that way necessitates a government of a certain size. It necessitates an army of a certain size. All of those things impact us, not to mention just the moral element and the moral effect of governing in this sort of imperialist kind of a way.
And I think go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say that last line on the Bryan quote right there. We cannot repudiate the principle of self-government in the Philippines without weakening that principle here. I think that is, kind of it in a nutshell.
I think that is absolutely it. And I think that sentence itself is a seminar. Like if I had a class, we could have a bell work seminar, rapid fire, just on that sentence. Can you do, what does it mean to be consistent in your actions and your speech? What does it mean to be self-governed? And can you be self-governed while denying self-governance to others?
Which can lead itself into a whole conversation about self-government here in the United States and those people who have been denied the ability to participate in their government throughout history. And obviously the women's suffrage movement is certainly, roaring at this point at, 1900. So I would imagine that would have been read here at home as having a lot of meaning domestically also. Absolutely.
Well, I think that is a perfect spot to end on. That was a bit of a rapid fire run through some great text, some really powerful documents that you can put in front of your students. Gentlemen, do you have any kind of last words or thoughts on what came out of this conversation, what doing this close reading was like for you?
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, then I will say that I think that it is a great document, the Monroe Doctrine, to really dig into deeply with your students at the start of your year, because it really is going to establish something that you can come back to again and again with regards to America's foreign policy over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So it serves as a great barometer for how America has evolved over our history, and to kind of ask students, is this still what we believe today in our conversation about what America's ideals are, is a really useful tool.
Yeah, I think it gets right to the heart of that question of what is America's role in the world, and that's certainly something you can put up and have themes that you can return to. Like Chris said, I think it's really excellent in being able to compare it and look at also the evolving role of the executive. We didn't really get into when it was that William McKinley, stated this, and how that shows, either a changing or consistent role for the presidency in this. But I think it's a good way to also track that. What is the president's role in America's role in the world? It's like a question within a question. Which is fun. But no, I thought these texts were really, really fun to dive into, and I appreciate you leading us through them, Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you out there on the internet.
Yeah,
we'd love to hear your questions. Continue the conversation in the chat boxes. But for now, we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of 10th Period, Kirk.
In fact, we'll be back on Friday for a special Valentine's Day episode. Of the 10th Period webinars at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time on Friday, February 14th, 2020, I guess. And we're looking forward to that. It'll be a lot of fun. We're just going to explore. What's that, Chris?
Also, Arizona Statehood Day.
Oh, well.
Day, Frederick Douglass's birthday.
All kinds of stuff. We'll add that to the list, Chris. We'll make sure that Arizona gets a shout out. But it's going to be just an exploration of fun things that have happened on Valentine's Day, the significance of the holiday itself, and just some fun, interesting stories. A little bit of a fun diversion for you and for your students if they'd like to tune in as well. We'll be live and taking questions then too. So we'll look forward to that conversation. And till then, please, continue to send us comments. You can tweet at us at BR Institute or on Facebook at facebook.com/Bill of Rights Institute or on the chat box on YouTube Live, and we'll get back to you. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, guys. This was super fun.
Thank you both. This was great.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.